And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining us for our marine section of the forecast for today. Taking a look at our ice edge, we're going to focus on the area that's been opening up just north of the Bering Strait. We do expect that to continue to open up for the next several days with some of the warmer temperatures that we are seeing in the area. Taking a look at a quick recap of our weather focused on the marine areas with high pressure out over the Bering Sea, expecting some relatively lighter winds for much of the northern Bering down into the Aleutian Islands. Weak area of low pressure here could bring some channeled winds through tonight through some of the gaps in the Alaska Peninsula, but largely some weaker winds with this weak low as well. And then with high pressure out over the Gulf of Alaska, drier along the North Gulf Coast down into southeast Alaska, and high pressure usually means some lighter winds in those areas as well as up along the Arctic coastline. Some high pressure just to the north is going to keep some lighter winds there too, but there is a little bit of squeeze between that high pressure and low out over the interior that could bring a little bit of wind to those areas out of the east, kind of moving down the coastline here. Into Tuesday, kind of similar pattern, maybe a little bit tighter gradient up there, so maybe a little bit stronger winds on Tuesday just off the Arctic coastline, then heading down again the west coast of the state, but high pressure remaining out over the Gulf of Alaska, and it keeps some lighter winds through much of the North Gulf Coast down into southeast Alaska. High pressure continuing out over the western portions of the Bering Sea, so expecting some lighter winds out there. But again, could be a little bit stronger winds through some of the gaps of the Alaska Peninsula with this weak front pushing through the area. And then moving into Wednesday, kind of similar pattern here. We have high pressure out over the west, going to have some lighter winds out there with that high pressure, although really pretty weak here at this point, not providing a lot of southerly push through the gaps, but could bring some rain to some of the marine areas, especially on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula there. Still seeing some areas of high pressure up along the Arctic coast, enough to give a little bit of an easterly gradient here, expecting some easterly winds moving around the north slope coastline down to some of the west coast as well. And then our high pressure starting to weaken, but still extending that ridging out over much of the Gulf waters. So even though we are going to start to see some rain through much of the Gulf areas, still should be pretty light in terms of winds. That should be in the inside waters as well. So now that we took a look at some of the bigger picture, we'll take a closer look at some of the details. Starting off in southeast Alaska on Tuesday, pretty light winds, slight northerly component in the inside waters, getting up to as high as 15 knots in Lynn Canal area. Then out over the Gulf, weaker winds here out of a primarily westerly direction, only around 10 to 15 knots. On Wednesday, pretty light on all accounts, only getting up to around 10 knots for most locations. Out in the Gulf, primarily a southerly push. Southerly winds in the inside waters too. Biggest area of winds is going to be up in Lynn Canal area, out of the south at 20 knots there. For Tuesday for south central Alaska, fairly light here as well, 15 knots out of a south, eventually westerly direction as we get into the northern Gulf. Strongest winds, however, are going to be in the Cook Inlet area, out of the south at 20 knots there. Moving into Wednesday, light winds, only around 10 knots all throughout south central waters. Moving into Tuesday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, primarily a east to southeast push of winds here, 15 to 20 knots by Kodiak Island, 20 knots for a lot of the Alaska Peninsula, and weakening as we get closer to the center of the low pressure there, only around 10 knots of variable direction. On Wednesday, pretty similar. That low doesn't move much, so we still expect those lighter winds nearest to the low center. And then somewhat east to southeast direction for much of the Alaska Peninsula up to as high as 20 knots. We are going to start to see a little bit gradient down Shelikof Strait, northeast direction, 15 knots expected on Wednesday. For the Aleutian Islands, weak winds near that low, only around 10 knots for the eastern and central Aleutian Islands. Seeing some northerly winds up to as high as 20 knots by the western Aleutians. Then on Wednesday, still northerly direction out by the western Aleutians, just a little bit weaker, only getting up to around 15 knots Wednesday. And still light winds by that low pressure, only around 10 knots variable direction. Along the west coast of the state, we're going to see a westerly component up in the northern areas, but light winds, 10 knots there, 20 knots on the southern side of Nunavik Island out of a southeasterly direction, and then northwest 15 knots by St. Matthew Island, northeast 15 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Wednesday, really light winds out of the east, 5 to 10 knots. For northern locations, dropping down to south of Nunavik Island, southeast winds, 15 to 20 knots expected there. 15 knots out of a southeasterly direction by St. Matthew Island, and really light winds by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're seeing easterly flow here, getting up to as high as 20 knots all along the northern side. And then down the west coast, starting to get more of a northerly direction, wrapping around the land there, 15 knots, getting up to as high as 20 knots by the Bering Strait. Moving back up to the Arctic coastline, easterly direction, 15 to 20 knots up along the Arctic coast, and then really dropping down only around 5 knots along the west coast. I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.